welcome everyone, those who are joining us here on the feed, and our lovely guests who are with us right now. My name is Bassam Haddad. I will be co-hosting this first panel, or this series of panels today, with my partner in crime, Amani Jamal, who will be co-hosting the second panel. Kifik Amani. Okay.
اهلا
So
اهلا بسام.
Ahlan Amani. This is going to be a very brief introduction to the project and a couple of things about the pedagogy initiative, given that this particular panel is on teaching the Arab uprisings. First, we are delighted to have with us professors Marwan Kraidy, Nadyas Baiti, Thomas, Thomas Serre, pardon, and Rabab Rabab El-Mahdi, مش Rabab Abdel Hadi. This is two Rababs. So I always make that mistake. So we have these
Yes.
four participants, and we are very lucky to have them addressing different aspects of teaching the Arab uprisings. The next panel will be introduced by Amani Jamal directly after. So we will move from now until 1:15. Each speaker will have 12 minutes. At the 11-minute mark, I will sound an alarm of sorts that signals that you have one more minute. And then at the 12-minute mark, we will signal things that are more disruptive in order to be able to finish on time. This is, as many of the people here know already, this is a 1-year long project in terms of events, hosting what we call monthly signature events or panels that are taking place as we speak. We had our first in January, our second is today, and the third is in March on archives and the uprisings. And then in April and May, we already have panels that we will share with you on the website. You can find out everything about this project at thearabuprisings.org, the Arab Uprisings with an S.org. And we will also be sharing on there, and this is the last thing I will say before we introduce our first speaker. And that is that this portal will end up including a vast array of resources for educators, but also researchers, journalists, artists, and so on, who would like to learn more about the region or actually teach the Arab uprisings. So we will have a comprehensive list of books on the Arab uprisings curated by themes and categories. We'll have a comprehensive list of peer-reviewed articles on the uprisings curated in the same manner, and the same will apply to reviews in peer-reviewed journals of books, films and documentaries on the uprisings, as well as a host of other material that are useful for the classroom, including cultural and artistic production. So we will be updating everyone on this project, which will begin being populated as we are now doing the research in summer of 2021, in just a few months. And with that, let me say that this panel, specific panel today, is co-sponsored by the Arab Studies Institute, the Arab Barometer at Princeton, and the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. And it's also co-sponsored by the 17 research centers and units that are co-sponsoring this entire endeavor. As I shared, this will be about pedagogy and teaching the uprisings. We are hoping that our guests will speak to how they approach teaching the uprisings in the classroom, even if they address the uprisings en general. So we are very delighted to start with Professor Marwan Kraidy, who is currently the Dean of Northwestern University in Qatar. And he also teaches at UPenn. And along with every single person here, they have a bio that is this long, that we are going to actually uh, include in the feed on Facebook, and it will also be included when this entire event is shared in a post on various media. So with that, please allow me to welcome Professor Kraidy. Marwan, the floor is yours.
Okay.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Bassam and Amani, for inviting me to be part of this delightful panel and group of colleagues who I respect enormously. I'd like to frame my experience of teaching the Arab Uprisings between two locations. I was in Beirut. I was a visiting professor at AUB during the uprisings, and I taught a first undergraduate course about the uprisings. And then that was in 2011, 2012. And then I returned to Penn, where I taught a small honor seminar for a number of years on the uprisings, right? And so there are all kinds of challenges about teaching something that's ongoing as you teach it, as we know. But also, I think there, if you focus on enduring patterns, then there are things that emerge. So how do I characterize the events in my teaching? First of all, I characterize the uprisings as exactly that, as popular uprisings with an impetus towards popular sovereignty. And I focus a lot on language. I focus a lot on terminology. So that's sort of the introductory sessions of the class is about calibrating the language we're going to use to understand everything else. So clearly, the notion of Arab Spring is a very fraught moniker. Technically, a revolution is not a revolution until it concludes, until a new system has completely replaced the old. So to illustrate the problem with terminology and really the broader issue of the power of naming, I refer back to a bunch of examples. So when I was in Lebanon, for example, students would always ask, about the 2005 popular demonstrations in Lebanon. These were locally called the Independence Intifada, Intifada al-Istiqlal, but clearly in the US, they were called the Cedar Revolution, and that was a mid-level State Department person who called it the Cedar Revolution. And so we discussed, why that was the case, and why does a moniker end up dominating? Is it, it's likely that Intifada is a clear intertextual reference to Palestinian activism, and therefore may be undesirable in US public discourse, for example, right? Then I also spend even more time explaining the prevailing slogan and what it really means, at least to me. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, right? Everybody translated it as the people want to topple the regime. And I insisted and emphasized and argued that it should be the system and not the regime. Saying this means the people want to topple the system decenters the focus from the dictator as a figurehead to a local political economic system, itself entangled in both a global political economy. So, to do that, for example, we talk about labor activism in Egypt and other places in the Arab world and how it connects to global labor activism. And of course, it's also embedded in global geopolitical consideration and calculations that have supported Arab dictatorships for decades leading to the uprisings. Then I also contextualize historically. So I go back a century, a couple of centuries. We spent quite a bit of time discussing the Egyptian Revolution of 1915 to discuss the idea of the body in protest, which is a particular interest of mine, but also to show that the new media and popular culture of that day, because everything is new when it's new, right, were part and parcel of the revolution. Referring to several works, I found Ziad Fahmi's Ordinary Egyptians to be particularly useful. We refer to also to the Iranian Revolution to show the role of religious, political, social networks in dissent before media and technology take it over. But we also study the French Revolution. We go back to 1789 to discuss issues of gender, the body, and revolutionary action, and to understand how demands of citizenship, for example, are very gendered, right? And I refer back, I have the students read some old and some newer stuff by John Scott about the French Revolution, to look, for example, at how abstract citizenship is always by default an unstated masculine citizenship versus embodiment, and therefore women are always second-class citizens, right? How do these notions translate to the contemporary Arab world? We don't just bring them as is, but we translate them, we contest them. But these kinds of things are also useful to dispel the very misguided notion that the Arab uprisings were not violent. There's also another important contextual dimension, which is the global circulation of what I call insurgent affect and insurgent aesthetics, which explain sort of the global entanglements, the appropriations, the co-optations of creative insurgency acts that we saw in Egypt and Tunisia and Syria and Bahrain, etc. As an example, we have a day where we discuss how Femen, the collective that was born in Russia and that's now mostly in Europe, how Femen has appropriated some of the activist events and incidents of the uprising. And for that, I use a variety of readings from the press, but also specific readings about Femen, but frame them in broader conceptual notions. The work of Layla Ahmed, her work on her notion of colonial feminism, Layla Abu Loghod's work about sort of the white impulse to save Muslim women and more generally brown women. But there are also two intellectual contextualizations that are very important in the work. One of them is in political theory, right? So we trace, because I want the students to understand that things did not begin in 2011. And unfortunately, the stuff that they read seems to suggest that this is new, this has never happened before, that this is unique, that this is unprecedented, all the grandiose claims about the uprising. So we trace, for example, the notion of the body politic. We go back to medieval Europe, where it started developing. Ernst Kantorowicz's The King's Two Bodies is a central work in that respect. I found that undergrads hate it; they don't resonate with it at all. So I try to find stuff from the press that fleshes out some of these notions. The work of some phenomenologists, whether Claude Lefort, who's a Marxist phenomenologist who looked at the dictator, mostly at Soviet dictatorship. But also biopolitics, the work of Foucault and Agamben, and then move to more contemporary work, Middle East-focused work that deploy these theories, chief among them Lisa Wedeen's work. And finally, there's one important contextualization in the intellectual history of the study of social change in the Middle East, where media, sort of the fetish of technology, the magic of technology is central. I call that Plato's digital cave, which is a lecture I presented at AUB in 2011 and got a lot of sort of pushback about what that means. But basically, technology is an enduring agentic presence in how Western social science has understood social and political change in the Middle East. This goes back to Daniel Lerner, The Passing of Traditional Society, which came out in 52, I believe, in the early 50s. And he has the story, for example, of the grocer and the chief, right, in the village of Balgat, which is now part of Ankara, Turkey. The grocer is the media-savvy cosmopolitan who has a transistor radio. People come to him to listen to news from the world. And the latter, the chief, is sort of the emblem of authoritarian traditional authority, right? If you look at the narrative about Wa'el Ghunaim, for example, the sort of Silicon Valley Arab native hybrid whose tech-savvy threatened the local dictator Hosni Mubarak, it's almost an unchanged adaptation of the grocer and the chief from Dan Lerner. And that was a very dominant narrative in the press, both in the US, in Western Europe, but also in the Arab world, unfortunately. My general approach, my general methodology to teaching this is comparative. It's comparative, as I mentioned, across historical periods, across geographic contexts, but also across different media genres. Not just sort of news and entertainment, but things like memes, digital memes, all the way to graffiti on the walls and how they differ, right? And also a comparative approach across repertoires of activism. I try to focus on the tension between broad patterns that seem to exist everywhere and local specificities. But I also try to focus on how the sort of translocal, transnational circulation of expressive forms undermines, in some cases, and in other cases reinforces local and national patterns. So jokes, symbols, memes, graffiti, puppetry, songs, mock funerals, street theater, this is the stuff that public culture is made of. So I can't even imagine understanding a popular uprising without not only including these as primary texts, but also centering them in the analysis. We read when I was in Beirut, most of the class focused on primary texts, and I found that extremely useful, particularly that these primary texts were coming, online or appearing on the streets. In some cases, a lot of Syrian revolution graffiti was appearing around AUB at the time. So I did not focus, I centering pedagogy around primary texts and offering literature that helps students understand and interpret primary texts, I found to be a much more useful approach than having them read literature as the basis and then having them look at primary texts as exemplars that illustrate the literature, right? So if I begin with a primary text, I find there's more conversation in the classroom. I find there's a more genuine engagement in general with the topic. So I don't, in terms of what to include, what the students do, again, the focus on primary texts was central, right? I tried to spend a lot of time basically synthesizing some methodological issues. How do you interpret primary texts? How do you analyze them? How do you connect different texts to each other? How do you provide an institutional sort of political economic analysis that frames how you understand the primary texts? And so the students had to write short papers that focused on individual texts, let's say a video, an episode of, Masasat Matti's finger puppetry from Syria, for example, or the videos of the famous Rabab videos about Ben Ali in Tunisia, or even analyze individual pictures, the pictures of people in Tahrir Square wearing pots and pans on their heads. What does it mean? What is it for? How does that allow us to understand broader context? And I found that approach resonated very well. Once I moved to Philadelphia, the focus, of course, became not just the uprisings, but in the students' paper, right? In the readings, it was always the French Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, some stuff about labor activism throughout the Arab world, some stuff on gender and contestation and public space, stuff of sexual harassment, things of that sort. Once I moved to Philadelphia, the readings stayed relatively the same, but student papers switched to focus on sort of activism globally. I got papers on the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. I got paper about rural activism in India. But that comparative framework persisted throughout, right? So students—
Have 1 minute, Marwan.
Thank you. Students were using readings about the Middle East, about the uprisings, to flesh out other contexts, to understand other notions of activism and other incidents in other places. And I think that's very important, right? To create this collision, this dialogue between sort of studies focused on one area and parallel events or equivalent events or similar events occurring in other areas. That it helps deprovincialize the literature. In other words, work on the Arab world is relevant far beyond the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marwan. This was an enlightening discussion, and I am really excited that we have you, and we also have Hatem Al-Hibri in the next panel addressing the uprisings and the media in various ways. Let me just say one more time that Marwan is Dean of Northwestern University in Qatar and the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics and Culture at Northwestern University. Next, we are delighted to introduce Nadyas Baiti, who is an Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, CAMES, at the American University of Beirut. And Nadya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Bassam and Amani for inviting me and including me in this really excellent series of panels. This is really exciting. I've already learned a ton from Marwan, and I'm looking forward to and desperately searching and seeking out new texts and new methods to teach the uprisings as I continue into this next couple of semesters. So I titled my remarks today, Teaching Protest and Possibility in the Classroom, and I feel like now I need to be much more specific. So I'm going to be specifically discussing this through the pedagogical potential of science fiction. Over the last 18 months or so, I've been trying out something or somewhat different approaches in the classroom for thinking through and teaching what we talk about collectively as the Arab Uprisings. So I'd like in my brief remarks today to focus specifically on the Lebanese context and extrapolate or draw from that instance some methods, sources, and approaches that can lend themselves to thinking about teaching these uprisings as a collection of related but also distinct historical moments and political unfoldings. My approach to teaching was triggered, or to teaching the Lebanese context through the sort of lens of science fiction, was triggered by or inspired by, and it depended on my perspective on any particular day, whether it was being triggered or inspired, by witnessing and participating in the Lebanese protests in the fall and winter of 2019, and by what ensued in the year plus since then in terms of economic meltdown, pandemic, port explosion, and overall political unraveling. So in the fall and winter of 2019, massive demonstrations took place in major cities and rural areas throughout Lebanon, what many have called and would still call a fawda. I participated in and witnessed these demonstrations mostly in Beirut. As hundreds of thousands of people flooded into the cities and towns around the country, I witnessed what I could only describe, I think, as a veritable explosion of imagination, right? Unbounded imagination, all of which structured protesters' demands for a better life in this country, a life that made for them a particular kind of political, economic, and moral sense. During the weeks of protests, new possibilities were on display everywhere, right? Demonstrators and activists offered concrete plans for how to revise the constitution, overhaul the judiciary. They called for public reclamation of privatized spaces and insisted on broad-based collective actions that would ideally bring about an end to sectarianism, patriarchy, homophobia, and racism. And here, I'm not the first to say, but I do want to mention that even though I've taught Middle East history and Middle East studies and the history of protests and uprisings for the past several years, there was something incredibly revitalizing about actually feeling like you're living in this particular moment, and which has also then recast that history of protest in Middle East history, of labor issues, of social movements, of peasant movements, of women's movements, and the sources that historians have often used to study them, they've recast it in a whole new light and have recast the different kinds of ways that we can use the same kinds of sources to do that. The protests in Lebanon in that fall and winter exposed the impoverishment of a certain epistemological hegemony that has, quote unquote, explained Lebanon as paradoxically exceptional in its purported westernized modernity and also hopeless in its oriental sectarianism. The inadequacy of these frameworks echoes those that have been applied to the region as a whole, right? And many of those were quickly dispatched by the demonstrators, revolutionaries, protesters in the streets over the past decade. These mass movements in 2010, 2011, the ones that we're calling the Arab Uprisings, serve to inform and also to remind the world of more than a century-long history of popular actions across the Middle East and North Africa. And yet still, when Lebanon was itself enveloped in protest and revolution late last year, and late the year before last now, the extended moment belied nearly all the sort of conceptual tools that I was taught and had kind of accumulated as an educator of the region, and then over the last 5-6 years in the region, right? So in this, I very much share a lot of Marwan's kind of observations, having been at AUB. It became clear to me that we really need new ways to kind of capture and process what we've been witnessing and living. By the beginning of December of 2019, so less than 2 months after the protests began, right, the popular mood had kind of morphed from this euphoric kind of determination to much more of a despondency, right? There was a sense of desperation and a sense of kind of increasing political and social and economic loss. Faced with increasing violence from the army, from police, from various militia groups, and compounded by a deepening economic crisis and a class rift, these organizing efforts felt stymied and eventually felt very crushed. So I was casting about for a way to think creatively and hopefully about what this moment meant, and something that I could harness into a possibility, into an insistence on kind of what was being made possible, right? So even though there was sort of this, the way in which these protests were eventually being funneled down and feeling really kind of, feeling increasingly hopeless, I was trying to sort of capture this moment of possibility that we had been witness to. As an educator, I needed something also to try to offer students at AUB for many of whom the stakes of the protests resonated so personally, in order to try to continue to help them to imagine different possible futures and not the one that they found themselves in. I had long been an avid reader of fantasy, of science fiction, and speculative fiction. And all I could think about at the time were the ways in which these literary genres were constituted by this particular sense of very expansive imagination, this idea, this notion of world making, particularly through their play on time and space. Revolution, in its similar insistence on the need for imagination and the sort of process of world making and world building, then, is not so different than science fiction. So the spring semester of 2020, so about a year ago, I offered this class, a new class called Science Fiction in and the Middle East. And in addition to the protests in Lebanon, my inspiration was also what had clearly been a rise in science fiction and speculative fiction to emerge out of and about the Middle East over the past 10 to 12 years. So I designed the course as an interdisciplinary graduate seminar in which we engage science fiction as both text and method, right? And we read a range of historical, legal, and cultural works of scholarship, film, literature, both in translation and the original Arabic. And this is where I want to sort of emphasize, right, that looking through at protests and the Arab uprisings through science fiction also sort of offers a way in which to harness different kinds of languages for this, right? English and Arabic, but also other languages of the region. We also looked at tracks from physics and astronomy, which I like to say sort of brought this intergalactic dimension to studying the Middle East, which is not something that we often get when we look at the region. So my comments today then are really about sort of drawing from science fiction, right? As both text, where I'm going to talk about some of the sources that we read, and also methodology. So a couple of ways in which I've done this. So I assigned science fiction in the form of short stories or novels. And in particular, we read Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, Ibtisam Azim's Book of Disappearance, Hassan Balasim's Corpse Exhibition, Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq's Utopia, Mohammed Deeb's Who Remembers the Sea. We also watched Larissa Sansour's sci-fi Palestine trilogy, local Lebanese filmmaker Fadi Bai's Akhir Ayyam Rijal al-Ghad, so the last days of the man of tomorrow, and he came and actually spoke to the class. In addition to Ian Campbell's new book on Arabic science fiction, in which he sort of processes the history and breaks Arabic science fiction down into components, as well as short stories and magazine articles from the early 20th century press, primarily out of Egypt, where writers from the region were actually writing and imagining science fiction and possible technological futures in the Middle East in Arabic, right? And this is a kind of source that most of us don't have access to and remain in Arabic, but are optional and possible for students for whom that is a possibility. We also examined scholarly material that helped us think with and analyze science fiction and speculative fiction as kind of method, right? So some of the other things we read was Robin Kelly's work on imagination from his Black Radical Imagination text, Frederick Jameson's Meditations on Anthropology and Futurism from his Archaeology of Science Fiction, John Ryder's work on religion, colonialism, and science fiction, Amy Bong's work on migrant futures, Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, and Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism. So these are some of the texts that we read in terms of thinking through science fiction and speculative fiction as text, as literature, and then other texts that allowed us to think through what are the methodological possibilities that science fiction brings to the fore to allow us to sort of process these moments of protest, whether they're in Lebanon or elsewhere, in ways that are not sort of the same kind of sort of tropes and methods that we've usually used. And I use science fiction to frame the Arab uprisings then comparatively. Whether you locate the dynamics and processes in the Lebanese case, right, and the origins having originated in July of 2019 in the Palestinian camps, or in October of 2019, both of those open up historical continuities and legacies that help us situate the uprising in Lebanon comparatively in the same temporal moment and connect what are often perceived by observers and other participants to be separate spheres of activism, but that are responding to sets of unrelated circumstances. So the work of, say, Monet Makkawi and Islam Khatib, for example, help us to connect the events of July 2019 in the Palestinian camps with those of October 2019, instead of relegating them to separate spheres, or we might say to separate worlds. Science fiction also offers different ways for us to think about what teaching the uprisings comparatively might mean, right? Science fiction can allow us to delve into the deep historical roots that this genre has in the Middle East. We can situate them within genealogies and landscapes of the global South to produce all sorts of different critical thematic assemblages around themes of colonialism, imperialism, social justice, and climate change. One of the things in my class that we did was situate the philosophies of 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun and his work on empires and cyclical time, alongside interventions from Afrofuturism and techno-Orientalism. These juxtapositions helped us explore constructions of time and modernity, the implications and disruptions of technology, and various cultural revolutions. Significantly, we also considered what the contemporary sci-fi output from the region indicates about current political needs and desires, and the centrality of gender, race, and class dynamics to re-envisioning notions of futurity. So in that sense, science fiction helps us think about the Arab uprisings together, too. Science fiction tells us that thinking about the future is key to reimagining the past and also reframing the present. I think it's no coincidence that over the last 10 to 15 years, science fiction and speculative fiction and fantasy as genres have proliferated in parts of the world that have previously not elicited such a critical mass of works.
1 minute warning, Nadya, sorry.
Okay, alongside authors in West Africa, South Asia, and South America, right? Writers from the Middle East and North Africa have used these genres as a way to imagine other Palestines, other Yemens, Irans, or Algerias, for example. With political leaders regularly jailing writers for their opinions on the present, right? As many have sort of articulated, the option of recasting the present, right, through the reframing of fantasy or science fiction is becoming increasingly popular and increasingly more politically expedient and more urgent. So understanding science fiction as a way through an increasingly perilous political landscape is key to helping students understand it. And if they themselves have lived or are living under it, is a way to help them navigate it personally and intellectually. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadya. This was actually quite exciting, the approach that you're taking with science fiction. Thank you for sharing it with us. Again, let me just say that Nadyas Baiti is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, CAMES, at the American University of Beirut. Next, we are going to move to Thomas Serre. Thomas Serre has a PhD in political science from the EHESS. He is currently an associate researcher with, and this is in French in the bio, with Développement et Société in Paris, and an adjunct professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Toma, the floor is yours. And one thing that I tried to do, but I guess because of the view that we are showing of only the speaker, you cannot see us. I might be disruptive at the 11-minute mark, as I have been. I apologize for that. Usually we try to, get a wave out and so on. So I apologize in advance, Toma.
Thank you, Bassam, and thank you, Amani, for the opportunity to speak, to take part in this wonderful panel. And it was really great to hear what Marwan and Nadya had to say, because at so many levels it resonates with some of my experiences teaching the uprisings and in general teaching a course about the Middle East. I'm going to go straight to the point. It's easier if I have only 12 minutes. So I'm not teaching a class currently, a course about the uprisings, but a course about the trajectory of the Arab nationalist state from the counter-hegemonic and revolutionary period of the 1950s, 60s to the current era of neoliberalization, securitization, etc. And when I present the course like that, it sounds like a very monolithic way to talk about or think about the Arab nationalist state. And it's obviously one of the problems that are inherent to the fact of teaching a course about the region, whether it is the Middle East or the Arab world. And obviously, the region is associated with a set of very systematic, monolithic ideas about Islam, about authoritarianism, about terrorism, about patriarchy. And one of the things that we try to do when we teach is to reintroduce some nuance and to try to be critical about these notions. And the problem that I encounter is that I taught in Europe, and now I teach in the USA, and I am dealing with students who are often not familiar with the region. So if I teach a class on the Arab world or the Middle East as a whole, and I present the incredible diversity of the region, what is going to happen, and what happened in the past, is that most students are simply overwhelmed, which doesn't help at all, actually. So what I'm currently doing is that I'm focusing on 4 countries: Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. And these 4 countries allow me to isolate a set of recurring patterns and very important nuances and differences. The patterns, we know them. These are secular states with a history of autocratic rule, but also never-ending economic restructuring and popular uprisings. And the differences, well, they appear spectacularly when you look at the uprisings of the past 10 years. So I actually speak about the uprisings during the last 3 weeks of the course. And at the very beginning, I speak about Tunisia and Egypt together. And during the last week and a half, we focus on Algeria and Syria. And the question is, why would I speak about the Algerian Hirak and the Syrian revolution turned into a civil war together? Because they seem to be completely different and opposite even. But for students, the first thing that is obvious is that they recognize a set of recurring patterns, in the sense that these systems are political orders are fairly similar. You have the dominance of security apparatuses and the military. You have this socialist tradition with a strong anti-imperialist political culture. You have these state business networks that are also clientelistic, and you have also this rich history of popular resistance. So these 2 political orders can be compared. Yet, when you look at the uprising, you have these 2 trajectories that are obviously completely different. So we have different ways or different nuances that can be discussed in class. And here I'm just going to mention 2 of them. I'm going to let aside the question of sectarianism because that's another discussion. But there is the question of the violence itself and the question of temporality. So the violence. Speaking about violence in Syria and non-violence in Algeria is actually very helpful to debunk a set of myths on the region. For example, if you start by looking at video clips, cultural products that appeared in Syria in 2011, 2012, and you compare them to the non-violent means of resistance in Algeria in 2019-20, well, this is fairly similar. I'm not saying that the uprising in Syria was not violent at all, but nonetheless, you have similar means of non-violent resistance, which means that violence doesn't come from the bottom. Violence is not cultural, violence is conjunctural. And that's something that seems obvious to us, but students are always need a reminder. Then let's look at the violence and the propaganda of the 2 regimes together by looking at video clips, at military songs in Syria, at the discourses of Syrian or Algerian ministers. Well, rapidly, here we have an opportunity to think about the meaning of the notion authoritarianism, which is one of these like very monolithic nonsenses that is systematically used to speak about politics in the Arab world, but in practice doesn't mean anything. And obviously, when you look at the discourses of the Syrian regime that try to discredit its opponents by calling them terrorists, and the type of raw military violence implemented by the Syrian regime, and you compare it to the likely authoritarian practices of the Algerian state, suddenly you need to rethink the notion of authoritarianism, because in Algeria, the state relies on a so-called democratic management of the masses, which means that the violence is not lethal and that it's judiciarized, it's legal or paralegal, it's not militarized. And this is very helpful to think about, to criticize the notion of authoritarianism, but also, and for students, once we start to look at police violence for American students, suddenly in 2020, it means something. They can compare what they see in the streets of Algiers to what they see on TV in the US. And what they realize is that the intensity of police violence in Algeria is actually comparable or inferior to the police violence on display in the United States. And that's very important. Moreover, we also have to think about the origin of violence, the origin of militarized violence in Syria, and the origin of non-lethal violence in Algeria. And we see that this strategy of democratic management of the masses comes from France, comes from Europe, through trainings. And this is something that they notice. Meanwhile, there is the militarization of the Syrian uprising is the consequence of foreign interference, systematic, which means what? We have an opportunity to discuss one of the most annoying cliches that circulate in public spaces in the US or in Europe about the Middle East, which is this notion of power vacuum. There is no power vacuum when you look at the systematic interference in Syria. What you have is an excess of power. And this is a discussion that is very important to have with students, because this notion of power vacuum is something that they have been dealing with for quite a long time. In general, there is another thing that is obvious when you compare the Syrian uprising and the Algerian uprising. It's the temporality. Temporality is clearly different. The uprising in Algeria happened in 2019. And it's true that by looking at protests, one of the things that Algerian activists and protesters systematically chant in the streets is Zaire Meshi Syria. And yes, Zaire Meshi Syria means what it means. We are not in the same trajectory, the same historical trajectory. The references for Algerian hierarchists are the revolution, the anti-colonial revolution, or the uprising of October 88, which allows us to think about this uprising in the longue durée, something that Marwan said earlier. We have to think about these uprisings in the longue durée by tracing them back to previous struggles, including the anti-colonial struggle. And here, I give them a simplified chronology with all the uprisings over the past 70 years in Algeria: 45, 54, 63, 1980, 1988, 1992, 1997, 2001, 2011, 2019. And this makes sense suddenly. They realize that this is also that it can be understood as one single unified struggle for justice and dignity. And this implies that we distance ourselves in the discussion from the immediacy of mass media and the narrow normative and unrealistic narrative of democratic transition. And these are very interesting things to discuss in class. And one of the last important things that I want to do is that I want Algeria, I'll be there, I want Algeria to serve also as a way to bring back some optimism in the discussion. Not naive optimism, but to reopen the future, the possibilities. And in order to do that, I rely on interviews that I've performed with activists in Algeria, and I show them to my students. And these activists say, well, we have tried in the past, we have succeeded and failed and succeeded and failed, and we will try again and again and again, and the Hirak will never die. And that's something that is important. So obviously I give them primary sources and secondary sources. I give them theory to read, and that's always painful for them, even if it's useful. But there is nothing like the direct testimony of an activist who is explaining what they are doing in the real time and how they see their struggle in the future, in order to bring back some kind of distance and understand that these movements do not fail in 6 months or 2 years. They continue and they have an afterlife. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toma. We really appreciate these comments, especially on Algeria and North Africa, as no matter how much we all try, there's always this sort of gravity that is in the what is called the middle of the Near East. Thank you very much. Again, let me just say that Toma has a PhD in political science from the EHESS and currently is an associated researcher with Développement et Société in Paris, an adjunct professor at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Next, I am delighted to introduce Rabab El-Mahdi, who is an associate professor of political science at the American University in Cairo, and she will share with us her views in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to plug in something that is quite interesting that's happening tomorrow at 11 a.m. EST, Washington East Coast time, and that is the launching of a new podcast titled Europe in the Middle East, in which our colleague here, Thomas Serre, as well as Alain Gresh, will be hosting Liz Fiquet, and they'll be talking about Eurabia and the Great Replacement. So I hope you can join us for this launching of this podcast, and we will actually put a link to it in the feed. In the meantime, Rabab, it's a pleasure to have you as always, and I really enjoyed your impression of the Lebanese accent before we went live. That was really impressive. Rabab, the
That
floor.
wasn't meant to be live. But thank you, Bassem, and thank you, Amani. This is such a learning experience, this panel. So I just want to start by saying that I'm going to limit my comments to dilemmas and challenges that I face in terms of content, in terms of what do I teach in the classroom, as opposed to another set of dilemmas, maybe that, I'll just mention briefly towards the end, having to do with the context that I teach in, which is Egypt in the current moment, right? Because that has another set of its own challenges, but I don't think it's as generalizable, alhamdulillah, thank God, as what I'm going to share with you. Again, I also think that many of those challenges are, even though they're general, they also have to do with my particular positionality as someone who participated and witnessed the Egyptian uprising, and who teaches in English. So oftentimes I find the representation and analysis of events, not to mention the conclusions and inferences, lacking, to say the least. And the fact that I teach in English limits me to the literature and content that is available in English. Now, I will start with just going through the four main challenges that I face, and then go into how I try to solve them over the past decade. So the first problem has to do with the fact that I actually teach the Arab uprisings in the context of poli-sci programs. So whether I do this at the American University in Cairo or when I'm visiting in campuses in the US, I teach courses in political science programs as opposed to broader Middle East or Arab studies settings or institute. And this I think, adds another limitation having to do with the discipline. So one of the first challenges I find in how is how the discipline, political science, phrases the issues and the uprisings, how it's narrated. This starts with the questions revolving around particularly regime change and outputs in that regard. And this I find very limiting because, as Marwan rightly said, I believe that those moments of uprisings, continued moments of uprisings, were much more than a call for regime change. Again, it was a call for structural changes. The second problem I find is that many of the texts, the academic texts that one would use existing paradigms and approaches. So again, they are limited or see the Arab uprisings within pre-existing prisms, particularly dominant in political science. So whether that's the transition literature, democratization, broadly speaking, or other approaches of social movement theory and whatnot. Again, given the fact that those particular uprisings happened in a different historical moment and were, in my view, much more than an attempt at regime change, I find that those pre-existing paradigms and approaches often lend themselves to a very limited reading of the Arab uprisings. The third problem I find is that most of the literature subscribe to pre-existing construed categories. That's a very Eurocentric, I want to say, or has to do with the Eurocentric gaze of the region. So the categories have to do with Islamists, of course, the youth, so to speak, as one big bulk, not disaggregated. There are questions about women and women participation in the revolution, which I almost find always insulting. And those categories, again, are treated not just as a monolith, but basically as the only categories of actors that we see in the uprising, which again provide a very distorted image of what I have witnessed and has been part of. The final challenge is what I call the language barrier, and here I don't mean language just in terms of events happening in Arabic, so to speak, it being translated in English, or the fact that there is a language barrier when I'm teaching in English and want to use material that's in Arabic. But I also think that the language was lost in translation, broadly speaking, also has to do with academic writing. And when I say academic writing, I don't mean, that it's some of the academic writing is clear and jargon free. But again, as James Scott noted early on, we are trained to write in a particular way that dismisses certain important insights as anecdotal. So many of those writings, even though they are from people who I know, could have provided much insights, insights, are also limited by how the publishing industry and the academic writing industry actually works. So having those limitations, I ventured to deal with them or try to overcome them in a number of ways. The first is that early on in any of my courses, I introduce students to interpretive methodologies such as discourse analysis. This allows us to deal with primary sources and raw material later on. I capitalize on methodologies from cultural and critical studies and don't limit myself to the predominant methodologies in political science. I afford to give 1 or 2 classes early on, even though they're not dedicated, even though the course is not dedicated to methodologies, to just introduce them to the range of methodologies out there, so that when we later on bring in those primary sources, we can actually collectively analyze them and create our own narrative, so to speak. The second thing I do is that I do not limit myself to academic texts by political scientists, rather those limited to the Arab uprisings. So I include writings by anthropologists and sociologists on the region and their analysis of the uprisings. As long as more general texts, whether it's, Badiou or Zizek or others who actually have analyzed the Arab uprisings within the broader context of the 21st century. This I find very helpful when combined also with classical texts on insurgency, protests, and revolutions, anything from Lenin to Foucault. So that provides them, in my view, with a broader prism to look through at the events we're discussing. The third thing I don't limit myself to academic literature. So in the classroom, I would use non-academic and assign non-academic books by journalists, or even sometimes by bloggers and tweeters, if that's a word, who have actually written about the uprisings as leaders or as participants of those uprisings. Of course, we read them very critically with the background of who those people are, how they viewed themselves. So there's a lot of reflexivity involved when reading such material. I also use media reports, both written and visual, anything from the BBC and Al Jazeera. And luckily, there is a huge wealth out there because it was hip and popular, and everyone, produced a number of documentaries or made long interviews and whatnot. The fourth thing I do is that I try to overcome what I think of as a very limited focus of the discipline on regime change and authoritarianism when viewing the uprisings, by including topics that are not, I don't think, are usually included. So I would have 1 week dedicated to graffiti. We look at graffiti throughout the uprisings and the Hirak, across the Arab world. I have a week dedicated to music, and we look at anything from mahraganat to rap to even music of Latin America, and see where they converge and diverge. And the final thing I do is, as Marwan also said, I discuss the uprisings and look at them in a comparative perspective. And what I mean comparatively is both within, across Arab countries. Again, I make sure to disaggregate. So, it's not just, the Arab uprisings. We're not, as Marx said, potatoes in a sack of potatoes. I emphasize an Arabness to it, which I believe in, but there's also different countries and different dynamics. But the comparative perspective also has to do with other regions, whether it's the so-called colored revolutions, and I don't like this name, or even a historical approach, including things like 1848 and other incidences. I also find this very helpful in the fact that it deconstructs preconceived notions that they come to the class with, that this is, you know, a one-off event, or that it's something either, you know, that no one else have done, or that it was doomed to failure from the get-go, and that this is the end of it, as opposed to, you know,
1
continued.
minute warning.
Yes, I'm done. I'm done. So putting it in perspective, in this comparative sense, and across regions, including, of course, Latin America, which I find extremely useful in that regard, is very helpful. What the final problem that I could not encounter is that this takes a lot of time, especially when you're teaching in English and there are non-Arabic speakers. So the having to translate the graffiti, the music, and whatnot, always poses a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabab, for this always enlightening and insightful presentation coming from the heart of the Arab world and the heart of Egypt. And we are delighted actually to have today with us both Marwan and Rabab, who are speaking from the region, as this has been one of our concerns, that we actually engage with faculty and instructors and interlocutors who actually live in the region and teach in the region. We're also all engaged here by Toma, who's now in Paris. So as well as Nadya, who is also in at the AUB in Beirut. So our panel today is very non American. So I will now have, well, let's see, we have about 10 minutes before we go to the next panel. Before I ask my partner in crime, I keep saying partner in crime, Amani. If you don't like it, please let me know. I can easily stop saying it, but it sounds strong. So before I ask Amani to share any thoughts she might have, let me just say our next panel, which will start in 10 minutes, will include James Galvin, Khalid Madani, Sarah Shields, Ali Ahmida, and Hatem El-Hibri. So with that, let me see if Amani would like to pose any questions or share any comments.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for this amazing panel and shedding your insights into how you approach the teaching of the Arab uprisings. What was really fabulous is to hear how contextualized the pedagogical approaches are, how you're getting people to think about the Arab uprisings as such, based on where you were located also as the Arab uprisings unfolded. So this is very amazing in terms of the insights and points it will offer people who are trying to sort of enhance their own teaching in this area. I do have a question, and it's one that I struggle with when I teach, especially on the Arab uprisings. As you all know, and many of you sort of hinted at this in your presentations about different resources, variety of resources, but there's been a wealth of material circulating on the Arab uprisings, whether it's in popular culture, film, video, social media. If I wanted to ask you, and sorry to put you on the spot, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to do this. If you can tell me that your top two, not like non-articles, non-academic literature, the top two, let's say cultural or social media or films that you think really must be a teaching resource, what would they be? If we can just go around.
That would be great, actually, and we will hold you to it because we'll write them down. And if everyone can take 1 minute so that we could have time to make the switch to the second panel. Thank you, Amani.
Maybe in the order of presentations, Marwan, if you.
Sure. Yes. So a few things that are easily available on YouTube. I mentioned the Syrian collective Masasat Matti's work. I find those fabulous because they we can debate whether this is a good thing or not, because they address a global audience without compromising on the integrity of local issues, right? So I like those a lot, and they have their own English subtitles, so you don't need to do any translation. I also, in terms of visual, I like there are lots of graffiti collections. I can't think of any one in particular, but I found the range of graffiti from stencils to murals that appeared in Cairo in particular to be absolutely fabulous to teach with. The students really react to them. Maybe I should stop there. And obviously, you know, Jadaliya is a great source.
Excellent.
Right?
No, thank you so much. I think then now I'm gonna turn it over to Nadya.
Hi, well, I was gonna say Jadaliya for sure. But I would say, sort of again in the vein of kind of thinking about science fiction as a set of texts that offer some methodological approaches, I really have found myself actually returning, you know, time and again to Robin Kelly's work on imagination. And then thinking with that, in particular with Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein and Baghdad, and Larissa Sansour's Palestine trilogy. And I just want to, you know, emphasize in the sense that I think one of the things that science fiction really allows us to think is not just about focusing on an uprising or a protest, but also like the larger sort of definitions, these sort of associated dynamics and processes that actually reflects. And then if we can sort of proceed with that expansive definition, then we're actually sort of opening up the kinds of texts, whether audiovisual or written, that we can then actually use to think through these moments, whether historically or in the contemporary moment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nadya. Science fiction. Thomas.
Obviously, all these websites, news websites in English are very helpful when you deal with a population of students who do not speak Arabic. So Merib, Jadaliya, Middle East Eye, all of these are treasures. But in general, I like my courses to have a playlist. So I would say music. In North Africa, rap music in particular, because North African rap music is very good. So typically Lotfi Deka in Algeria, and Rasil Bled, which is a song by El General for Tunisia, which is a classic. And also something important, Revolutionary Dabkes for Syria, and a little clip on Tahrir where people sing El Waya Biladi, because I think that these like moments of people singing at night are very important to capture the fact that a revolution is a party, and parties do not die, they leave memories. And that's something important.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm going to go back and listen to some of these songs that you suggested. Last but not least, Rabab, take it away.
Okay, so one of the sources I can't mention here because this is recorded. I live in Egypt, so but what I usually do is that I just go on YouTube and then, you know, I type ultras, for example, and then I take this, or I type Algerian Hirak, and then I watch what's there and take it. I find Jadaliya, sorry to say, very very helpful. Again, short and concrete and always critical. And the final thing is the BBC documentaries. I can send you some links to those.
Excellent. That would be wonderful. We would place all of these suggestions on our platform. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Amani. Let me say that as we prepare to switch to the next panel, let me say a couple of words about the resource portal, which will actually live on the arabuprisings.org website. It will include a near comprehensive list of documentaries and film addressing the Arab uprisings, and not necessarily always from a non-fiction perspective. It will also, and that's more important than just having a list, because we do have a list of all films, TV shows, and documentaries produced on the region altogether since I mean for more than 2 or 3 decades now, on the Knowledge Production Project, which we have worked on so far for about 13 years at knowledgeproduction.com. But some of these things are actually not useful, because when you present, like on the same project, all books on the Middle East and all peer-reviewed articles, you're confronted with tens of thousands of pieces and you don't know what to do with them. So we're going to curate these lists into a more manageable, digestible set of categories and themes, whereby we funnel them down. And yes, it will be editorialized. So this is sort of the potential drawback, that yes, it will be editorialized by the MESPI team, the Middle East and the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative team, and the board that actually undergirds the team. You can find all this information at mespi.org. We will be editorializing the material that we find most useful for educators in terms of either audiovisual material, articles that are scholarly, books that are scholarly or otherwise, and as well as a number of other resources, such as think tank reports. Yes, some of them actually can be read without having a heart attack, but it's actually only a few, as well as actual websites. So we have a list of more than a couple of thousand websites on the region, and a couple of hundred of them address the uprising. And we will funnel this down yet to a more manageable size, so that you could actually, for instance, choose that you want something on Yemen, that's all you care about, or you want something on gender and the uprisings. Any websites that address this will come up in the search. So this will actually be underway beginning this summer, and we hope that most of you listening, and hopefully the participants for sure, and definitely the people in charge of or part of the 10 Years On project, will be able to contribute. So on the website, there'll be a wiki-like function where people can submit their own suggestions, because we're not going to get everything right. And we would love to have those. And this will include Arabic as well as French, and potentially other languages, including Kurdish, Turkish, and so on. So I'll stop here and offer Amani the floor, and thank all of our speakers for being always eloquent and generous. And we hope that we turn these presentations into short essays that we can share with everyone who's willing to read and use as a resource. And we'll welcome the next panel. I'll sign off right now, although I'll be around, and I give the floor to my partner, Amani. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. That was an outstanding panel. Really, really, really appreciate it. It's good to see all of you again. And many of you we've been in conversation with, so it's been really nice to see you, and hopefully we'll be meeting soon if we can get vaccinated. Okay, so now we're transitioning to our second panel on this topic. It's a great delight to be welcoming James Galvin, Khalid Madani, Sarah Shields, Ali Ahmeda, and Hatem Al-Hibri. Is everyone here? Okay, so Khalid, nice to see you. Hatem, I see. Sarah is here, but she is, camera is coming on. Sarah, nice to have you. Ali is with us. He's been with, nice to see you again. And I believe we're waiting for Professor Galvin. I think we'll wait for a few more minutes and then we'll begin. So I did want to say, you know, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bassam Haddad, because he always has the bullet points on introducing the pedagogy program, and as it fits into some of the other great work that they've been doing at MESPI and Jadaliya on teaching the Arab uprisings. our hope is to be able to document and showcase all the great teaching tips that we will gather today. And I'm going to turn it over to Bassam to say a little bit more about that while we wait for Professor Galvin.
Absolutely. We are indeed waiting for Jim. I'm hoping that everything is okay. I had just shared at the end of the last panel that we are featuring as part of this 1-year-long project, which is the 10 years on mass protests and uprisings in the Arab world. We are featuring a portal under the title, resources on teaching the Arab uprisings or something of the sort. It will actually commence in summer of 2021, and it will include everything that we have already on the Knowledge Production Project portal, which I will share with you. I'll just take 30 seconds since we are waiting. I am assuming everyone can see this window.
Yep.
Okay, so this is essentially our knowledge production project portal, which you can find at knowledgeproduction.com. And it basically has several databases that include all books on the Middle East, written in the English language since 1979, all peer-reviewed articles on the region, all websites that deal with the region, and all think tank papers, as well as various interesting data on think tanks, including testimonies that people who work in think tanks have actually delivered in Congress, and the connection between power and knowledge production at the think tank level, as well as the rotation that people who work in think tanks basically exercise between working in media outlets, government, academia, and within think tanks. So you'll find all this information at knowledgeproduction.com. We are going to take these databases, which I'm showing you right now, and we are going to work with the MESPI team, the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative team, and the board to curate the material from the Knowledge Production Project into digestible, manageable themes and categories on various topics, countries, and the region as a whole. And you can check out the Knowledge Production Project as a trial run where you could actually look at every single year in terms of production and so on, except that what you will see here, you will see in much more limited form on the arabuprisings.org website, which will only address the material on the Arab uprisings. And that is something that will hopefully be a resource, not just for educators, but also for students, researchers, journalists, artists, and even policymakers, if they have the courage to actually read this material. So with that, I will stop and welcome everyone here. And thank you for your generosity for joining us. I must say that everyone here was so gracious because we had to put together this panel quickly, given that the project started in January. So I appreciate, along with my partner, how everyone came through, and we hope to continue working with you. I'll turn it over to Amani, and I will be in the background. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Bassam, for that presentation. It's a great, fabulous project with the Arab knowledge production program. A lot of time and effort has gone into that, and it's a tremendous resource for all the disciplines in the field of Middle East studies. So if you have a chance to visit the website, please do. Jim has joined us. Welcome, Jim. We're excited about this second panel for the day. So I think we'll go in the order of the flyer, if that's okay with everyone. And if that's the case, Jim, if you're ready, we can start with you. I think the title of your talk is addressing the unanswerable question, why rebellions occur. Each speaker has 12 minutes. One of the things I hate doing on Zoom is having to interrupt people at the 11th minute. So forgive me in advance if I have to do that. Just we want to make sure that we are able to finish by 2:30 as we promised everyone. With no further ado, I'm going to transition over to Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I had lost internet connection, that's why I'm late, and I apologize for that, or actually AT&T should apologize for that. Okay. What I want to talk about is content. I want to talk about how we relate to students the pretty much unanswerable question about why rebellions occur. The protests that broke out in 2010, 2011 were arguably part of a wave of protests and rebellions that actually began in the mid-1970s and extended far beyond the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, and indeed globally. What I want to do today is address the question of why protests and rebellions break out in the first place. I'm using the word address for a reason. Although scholars sometimes talk about transhistorical causes like relative deprivation and J-curves, there really is no one-size-fits-all explanation for understanding why a particular protest or protest movements or rebellions occur. And as Charles Kurtzman reminds us, there are no ways to predict their occurrence. But there are approaches we can use to understand the causes of particular protests and rebellions. So this is how I teach why to my students. Protests and rebellions occur at the intersection of context, consciousness, and contingency. What do I mean by this? What I mean by context is the social, economic, and/or political backdrop that may or may not spark anger among a population. There are two things to consider about context. First, when thinking about context, it is necessary to do so on multiple levels: international, regional, and local. Thus, one can't think about the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011 without thinking about the global diffusion of a discourse of human rights. Then there was a global spread of neoliberalism, free market economics. Neoliberalism resulted in income disparities, crony capitalism, and the state's withdrawal from functions it had assumed during the 1950s through 1960s. On a regional level, one can't think about the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011 without thinking about the regional expansion of the depth and breadth of authoritarianism. Along with authoritarianism, there was a demographic bulge that resulted in 30% of the population being under the age of 30, which is actually a testament to the success of the post-colonial state. Finally, there was a region-wide spike in food prices in a region that is arguably the most heavily dependent region in the world on food imports. On a local level, you can't think about the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011 without thinking of governing structures and ties of regimes to their population, the strength or weakness of states, the wealth and poverty of states, and the ability of states to play on sectarian fears. Now, contexts, however, are subjective, not objective. And that's what I mean by consciousness. The particular circumstances that spark a resistance movement do exist, of course, but populations must translate their experiences into grievances, and then translate their grievances into plans of action. Autocracy or corruption or hunger doesn't necessarily lead to rebellion. It could just as well leave a population cowering in the face of government oppression or apathy. But when populations translate autocracy or corruption or hunger as a violation of inherent rights or norms and make that violation a call to action, then and only then does autocracy lead to rebellion. Finally, contingency. Contingency refers to the spark that sets off rebellions. The self-immolation of a street peddler in Tunisia in 2010 is one such contingent event. Contingent events require translation as well. After all, it's a multi-step process to go from self-immolation to blaming a regime for being responsible for that self-immolation, to equating that self-immolation to grievances about unemployment or lack of government accountability, to taking action. The case of Tunisia is instructive. 9 months before the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi and Sidi Bouzid, another Tunisian burned himself to death in Monastir under virtually identical circumstances. But unlike the event that took place later, nothing happened. Now, let me demonstrate the ideas of multi-level context, the translation of experiences into grievances, into actions, and contingency by looking at one 4-year period, 1977 through 1980. This was a period of unrest in the Middle East and elsewhere. We might look back and identify the context for that unrest: the widening and deepening of neoliberal economic doctrines, the global diffusion of a discourse of human rights that gives pride of place to individual human rights, a global economic crisis sparked by the collapse of the post-World War II economic system and the effects of the 1973 oil shock, and the end of decolonization and the exhaustion of the post-colonial state. All these things provided a backdrop for a variety of resistance movements throughout the region, each of which defined the problem in their own way, defined the solution to the problem in their own way, and defined the path they had to follow to arrive at that solution in their own way. For example, a group of Tunisians founded the Tunisian League for Human Rights in 1976-77. Obviously, they saw the problem as the authoritarian state and the solution as the implementation of global norms of human rights in Tunisia. Their strategy was to shame the Tunisian government for its human rights abuses. Egypt and other places experienced IMF riots. In 1977, Egypt was out for cash. The Egyptian government went to the International Monetary Fund for a loan, and in return, of course, the IMF demanded the Egyptian government adopt economic policies that were based on free market principles. The government therefore stopped subsidizing the bread upon which much of the population depended for sustenance. The result was 2 days of bloody rioting in which 80 to 100 protesters died and 1,200 were arrested. Over the course of the next decade, similar IMF riots broke out in Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, Algeria, and Jordan. Protesters saw the problem not as neoliberalism per se, but of betrayal by the state. Protesters sought to restore the moral economy, an economy that paid heed to the community values of economic and social justice that had disappeared as a result of neoliberalism. Iran, of course, experienced a revolution between 1977 and 79. Now, everybody focuses on the winners, the religious establishment, but here we can see multiple understandings of the problems and solutions. Those who went out on the street saw the problem as in multiple ways. In the main, the left, communists, and other intellectuals saw the problem as a Shah's subservience to America and American imperialism, along with the autocratic state. Some launched a guerrilla war against the regime. Others marched and protested. Women's rights organizations demonstrated and used a rights-based discourse to press their demands. Oil field workers who went out on strike did so originally to protest housing and wages. Landowners saw the problem through the lens of the Shah's efforts at land reform. Shopkeepers and bazaars saw the problem in terms of the Shah's economic policies and urban redevelopment schemes. Many religious leaders saw the problem in terms of the Shah's subservience to the West and Western ideas, and the Shah's indifference to the moral economy of the downtrodden within Iran, and Iran as downtrodden among nations. What all these groups had in common was opposition to the United States and the Shah. The idea of a vilayat al-faqih was not what most people had in mind. In Saudi Arabia, a millenarian cult which saw the regime as corrupt and un-Islamic took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979. The insurgents declared the brother of their leader to be the Mahdi and demanded the overthrow of the House of Saud. They claimed their takeover was in preparation for the apocalypse. After the takeover was put down, the Al Saud turned to find botanical group. This is the strain of Islam that generated Al.
I think Jim is having some technical difficulties. Jim, can you hear us? Okay, so I think just to keep the flow going, I'm gonna have to, Jim, are you there? Bassam, should we just go to the next speaker? What do you think?
I would just give it a few seconds just in case he comes back. This way we don't have to interrupt the next person. I think he just logged off right now and he will be logging on. So we will lose about 30 seconds or so, but it might work best to give it a try and then and then resume with the next panelist, who is Khalid
Khalid.
Madani.
Yeah,
Um,
so
Khalid, are you ready to fire in case we have to move forward?
What you tell me, Dr. Bassam. Absolutely. Let's do it. I don't mind being interrupted if he does come back on.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like as we are, doing this little banter, he's probably not gonna come on right away. So maybe كيفك خالد؟ والله مشتاق لك.
والله أنا بالأكثر يا دكتور. وأماني كمان وكلكم يعني. This is great.
very nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Amani.
على اساس ما حدا في يربحنا بالبانتر نحن العرب. Okay, so maybe Amani, maybe it's wise now because we tried as much as possible to hold the panel.
Yeah, and if he comes, we'll let Khalid finish his presentation. We'll segue back to Jim, and then we'll go to Sarah so that we don't interrupt Khalid.
Okay.
Okay. Your floor is yours, Khalid.
Thank you, Amani. سلم على منال على فكرة. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm always so excited to participate. I have to say that I'm a newcomer to this pedagogy forum. So I'm really here to learn. And I mean that very sincerely. I have been tasked with talking about the Sudanese uprising and what we call, of course, the revolution in Sudan. And it's always an honor to be part of this larger discussion, which I think is really interesting. In terms of teaching it, I was going to quickly almost summarize to Bassam and others and Jadli and say that over the years, I think it's beginning in 2011, I was giving a lot of podcasts and interviews on the build up to the Sudanese revolution. So one kind of teaching tool, not to plug myself, would be to go back to Jadli and follow the line of argument that began in 2011. I thought today I would talk about essentially how I would teach the Sudanese uprising. I've given a great deal of lectures on the uprising, not only in the US, but also in Lebanon and other countries as well, because it was such a momentous historical, of course, development. As most of you know, by April 2019, after 3 decades of authoritarian rule, one of the most brutal regimes in Africa and the Middle East was overthrown by a popular uprising. And now that the uprising itself was not necessarily something new, of course, in the history of Sudan. This was the third of its kind that overthrew an authoritarian government. And in that sense, it is distinguished a little bit from other regimes in the Arab world. So I want to talk about maybe what are the important empirical questions I bring to the table when I'm teaching this particular country, and then just 2 theoretical literatures that I think are useful to understand the case of Sudan, but also the region as well. But I just wanted to give just a very quick chronology because it really is very similar to other cases as well. December 19th, 2019, in the very, very famous town of Atbara. It's very famous in Sudan because it was and has historically been really one of the biggest towns where there's been a great deal of activism, and particularly unionist activism. It historically has been the city, the town where the Sudanese railroad was constructed under the British in the colonial period. And for decades, this has been a town that has been really prone to organization, political agitation, and protest. And in December 2019, the symbolic aspect of that protest that began there because of the imposition of austerity measures and the rise in the price of bread and other items becomes very important in the Sudanese imaginary, in the Sudanese imagination. And when I teach this course, I actually go back to the British period, the colonial period, to explain the importance of history and how it resonates in the imagination of Sudan in general. Very famously, during the sit-in in the midst of the revolution, the railroad, the historical railroad, came from Atbara town all the way to the capital of Khartoum and was received by millions of Sudanese in jubilation, so to speak. So that is an important date. And another date that is probably very useful for those interested in teaching Sudan is December 25th, 2019. December 25th, 2019 is a day that Lebanese are interested in, Egyptians are interested in, Tunisians are interested in, and because that's the day of the official emergence of the Sudanese Professional Association. The emergence of the Sudanese Professional Association, which is essentially an amalgamation, an umbrella group of informal unions of doctors, engineers, teachers, faculty, pharmacists, becomes a crucial coordinating body in Sudan. And for, in comparison to other revolutions, and this of course is something that is open to discussion, but in comparison to other popular uprisings in the region, becomes one of the most important factors associated with the success, the initial success of the revolution that toppled the regime, because this coordinating body was able to do something that had not been done before in Sudan, and that is to bring together different social groups and classes to schedule protest and to connect with street protesters. So you had a connection between the street protest and the middle class unionist, which becomes really important. Now, this is not something that did not occur in Egypt. You'll recall the neighborhood committees. And this is why I always like to just quickly talk about some of the comparisons that are useful to teach between Sudan, Egypt, and other Arab countries. Number one, of course, is the issue of social media. Sudanese activists really insist that they were inspired and borrowed and inherited a great deal of the content and the use of social media, particularly, of course, from the Egyptian case and the Tahrir revolution, which it becomes important. Now, an important aspect of that is that we all know this to be true. The slogans of Sha'b Yurid Isqat al-Nizam, and all of these are important. But what we really, in teaching, what we really need to do a better job of is to delve into the content itself and how it resonates within the context of different countries. For example, two very important slogans distinguished Sudan from its neighbors. One of them was Silmiya, Silmiya, Silmiya. This is not to say this is not important in other countries, but it becomes a really important mobilizing tool, insisting that this would be a nonviolent protest. That becomes really important as a strategy in the context of confronting the very violent coercive apparatus of the state. So that's really important. Another really important content associated with the social media slogans and flyers that were distributed was, and I learned this as early as 2011, confronting racism in Sudan head on. How would you mobilize not only people across class, but people across regions in ways that would encompass not only the Arabized ethnic groups, but also, of course, a very heterogeneous country? That becomes something that is really important to keep in mind. Another element is, two other elements have to do, of course, with the role of women. That becomes important. In Sudan, of course, 60% or more of the real street protesters were women. And that needs a really important explanation. And we need to be able to teach that as well. And another element that is very important, and this I generated from years of teaching Islamist movements in the region, and that had to do with something that is very important. And that is how the protesters were able to critique the Islamist project of the state in what is a generally, not generally, majority Muslim country, and generally, of course, conservative country, and one where the Islamist movement has historically been very, very strong. How does one actually critique the Islamist project in ways that are still resonate and are still legitimate among the population? So for many years, having studied the rise of Islamist movement, now we have the challenge to study and teach the emergence of, I would argue, in the case of Sudan at least, Muslim activists who are not necessarily calling for an Islamist project. The question becomes, what is the alternative? And my work with the youth organization Sudan was really highlighted that a great deal. Very quickly, because I know I'll probably run out of time, what are the kind of the two literatures that I think are useful to teach? One of them is very familiar in political science, and that is the authoritarian persistence thesis. I'm not going to elaborate on it. I think everyone is familiar with authoritarian durability. I have long been a critic of that and so many others. And here I think we need to combine that understanding of that thesis with what I think is really crucial and what I've tried to teach for many years, and that is to look closely at informal networks, not only in Sudan, but elsewhere. So, bringing in interdisciplinarity, I think is really, really important. Another, and that, I do when I teach the Sudan case. Another very important is really the use of social movement theory and the literature on social movements, which I think is really important, not only to look at informal networks, but recently I've become in teaching on Sudan and other, is to try, and it's difficult for me as a political economist, really, trained as a political economist, to try to understand the cognitive, and this is where James comes in, the cognitive and emotive aspects of these popular uprisings. Social movement theory makes some reference to it, but I think there's a consensus that we don't know enough. It's very difficult to teach. And that's why when my colleagues talk about using novels and other kind of tools, it really helps me start thinking about how do we really generate teaching tools and explain to students the emotive aspects and the cognitive aspects that are often left out of social movement and analysis. And I think the case of Sudan is really important. After all, Sudanese activists, one of the most popular slogans is Thawratna Thawrat Wa'i. Our revolution is a revolution of consciousness. How do we talk about that as a mobilizing force? So let me stop there because I'm thinking I went over time, and let James come in. You're welcome.
No, that was fabulous, and really giving us insights into the Sudanese protest movement and the events that sort of preceded it as it evolved. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Jim, we're glad to see that you're back with us. I'm sorry about your AT&T woes today, but if you'd like to continue where we sort of cut off, that would be great. And then we'll move forward to Sarah.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I feel like I'm living in Texas or some other third world country. I had just finished discussing a period of time in which we can apply this model of context, consciousness, and contingency to look at the way in which the uprisings emerge. This was a 4-year period, and another period of time in which there was a great deal of disquiet, of course, was the early 20th century. First, let me make sure, can people hear me?
Yep. Okay,
good. The context was broadly defined by two phenomena. First, there was the global financial collapse of 2007, 2008. And then there was the entrenchment of neoliberal economic policies, the savaging of social safety nets, the widening of the gap between rich and poor, the spread of crony capitalism, the reshaping of industrial and commercial and even spatial landscapes throughout the world. Both sparked pain and outrage across the globe. Now, at first, populations blamed their governments and replaced them when they could. In the immediate aftermath of the global financial collapse, for example, governments fell in the United Kingdom, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Iceland, Slovakia, Canada, the Netherlands, France, and Italy. In the United States, elections first threw out a Republican president, then a Democratic Congress. And throughout Europe, protesters and rioters took to the streets. Now, within a short period of time, the disaffected raised the stakes. Rather than targeting their governments per se, they blamed the very system that seemed to have abandoned them. Some of them staged protests associated with specific sites. Here's Porte de Sol, Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, Occupy Wall Street, the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul. In Hungary, Poland, Israel, Brazil, India, and the Philippines, a noxious form of xenophobic populism that found scapegoats in society's most vulnerable challenged the established order.
You're good, we can hear you.
Okay, good. In the United Kingdom, of course, there was Brexit. And then the United States, of course, had its Donald Trump. And the Arab world had its uprisings. In each place, the disaffected drew from local repertoires of contentious action, a term that was invented by Charles Tilley, and translated global concerns into local vernaculars. In the Arab world, crony capitalism became corruption. The savaging of the social safety net and increased income disparities became bread, freedom, social justice, and a job is a right. Complaints also reflected the fact that Arab states combined brutality with impunity. Then there was the 35-year-long struggle for human and democratic rights and economic and social justice. This then is the context for the Arab uprisings. I'll leave it up to your students to figure out the various acts of translation that took place.
Wonderful, Jim. Thank you so very much for that sort of historical view and broad comparative historical view. That's really important and insightful. Thank you so much. And thank you for your patience with all the technical difficulties.
Thank you for your patience, actually.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it. Sarah, I believe you are next on our flyer. Yes. And you are presenting on chronologies, context, and pedagogy 10 years on.
So I guess I should ask like everyone else, can you hear me?
Yes, we
So
can.
I wanted to say thanks so much for putting this together. It's been completely fascinating, and I've learned from all of the people who have come before on these two panels. My situation, I think, is quite different. I teach at a large public university in the American South, where most of the students in the Modern Middle East Survey course don't know much about the region. So I don't teach a course on the uprisings. I teach a broad survey. These students tend not to be history majors or people who are focused on the Middle East. They're taking it for some sort of distribution requirement. But they're overwhelmingly from North Carolina, from the US South, and they're keenly aware of racial justice issues, political power, and the recent history of campus protests. They're very bright and insightful, and few have already established positions on any current issues in the Middle East. The few exceptions come from the bases. North Carolina has a major Army base, a major Air Force base, and a Marine base. So military veterans and military children often come to my classes. So despite the fact that my syllabus has a very long list of goals for the course, the two most important ones are an imperative and a question. I first need to populate the region, and second, I need to ask them to think about how they know what they think they know about it already. Both came front and center in 2003 when a student announced that he had just come from a meeting with his congressman who asserted that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I asked him what the evidence was, and he responded that it was secret evidence. So we got to have a conversation in this big lecture hall about evidence, secrets, history, and democracy. During that discussion, another student challenged me. She said, "Why do you keep talking about the US killing Iraqis? We'll only go take out Saddam Hussein." And those were the words that she used. Because the students have never really considered, having had a steady diet of the American media, that there were other people in Iraq. So my goals are really pretty basic. And so I'm going to talk about how I try to teach the uprising with these two rudimentary goals of putting people in the Middle East and teaching them to interrogate their sources. Those two things, needless to say, influenced how I taught the uprisings in 2012. I'll talk a bit about those, then try to explain how it's different for me 10 years on. So way back then, 10 years ago, I introduced the uprisings with one of those online polls. I used Poll Everywhere, and I asked them what caused the Arab Spring before we did anything. I offered them multiple choices: religion, politics, economics, and education. The students tended, of course, to think of religion because that's what they think of when they think of the Middle East. So then I played a subtitled video of El President's Reis Abdel and asked them again the same poll, and the response shifted to economics. So we got to talk at that point how evidence changes what we think, and they were introduced to the idea that there are actually musicians in North Africa, which seemed to surprise them. That first year, I emphasized possibilities. In 2012, I began with another English subtitle music video that was shot in front of the crowds in Tahrir Square as their background. So more people, more subtitles expressed ideas that didn't seem very foreign to my Southern students. So I've been teaching this course every year, and 5 years on, I found myself unable to come up with a way to begin or to end the course and the discussion of the uprisings. The optimism had faded. Reality didn't seem like it was anything to celebrate. And it was at that point that I asked my teacher, Terry Barnett, who is still very insightful despite being in the final stages of brain cancer, how to keep from making the lectures just about failure. And he suggested that I focus on the possibilities of alternative futures. Despite the lack of media hype in the United States, as Jadalia readers know, resistance continues across the region, and we're not yet in a stage of failure. So 6, 7, 8, 9 years on, it seemed as though this round is played out. The results aren't upbeat. The uprisings have taken place among other revolutionary movements in the region. Instead of working the course around the Arab Spring now, it became part of a broader discussion, which compared among the governments on human rights, on economic challenges, and on political repression. But contexts mattered then, and they do now. And for me, embedding revolutionary movements, successful or not, in global context seemed to make them more real to the students. I'm not a sociologist, so I don't do theoretical models, though I found the ones that people have talked about so far to be really interesting. I emphasize things that are really concrete. This is the unemployment rate among people your age. What would you do to make a change if you couldn't get a job for the first 4 years after you finished at the university? And for a while, it seemed like historic change was taking place, as Jim mentioned, across space, across geographic space. They were seeing around them the Occupy movement and the sit-in in Madison. Gezi Park wasn't that far from Tahrir Square. And even today, the resistance continues. So how do you explain 10 years on, instead of vibrant optimism versus depressing pessimism, how you could think about alternative futures and teaching about ongoing resistance? So this is complicated for me by the thing that I wrote about in another panel on teaching that Jim edited in the Review of Middle East Studies. I'm politically and pedagogically opposed to being the sage on the stage. It's really hard to demand that students interrogate sources and then pretend that I can offer them all the facts. And I think students remember things they've figured out better than things that I tell them and they write down. So before COVID, I experimented with flipping the classroom when we could still have 110 students in a classroom. I didn't want them to just believe me, for example, that sectarianism wasn't the motivating force behind the uprising in Syria. I wanted them to figure it out. So in the past few years, I've been assigning the book Burning Country. In the lecture hall, I broke students into groups and asked each to come up with the answer to the big questions. Why did Syrians protest? Why did the spark become a fire? How did a peaceful uprising become violent? How did it become sectarian? What role did outside forces play? They come together and they argue about it, but they're thinking about it. I demanded that they think more broadly about resistance. Against the regime's statement, I am with the law, I asked how important it is to be law-abiding, even in the face of tyranny. And for comparison, I put a slide from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where these are his words. We can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. And he goes on to talk about how he would then, as he did in his life, disobey laws, that I am the law arguably is not something that that the students should pay attention to. It seems a little bit radical. Anyway, then I went back to interviews from the book about the goals of the resistance. Was it the overthrow of the regime? Did they want freedom for Syria? Was it possible to choose inaction when the government was shooting at unarmed people who were in the middle of praying? On the other hand, could a free country emerge if the regime was overthrown violently? And I offered a comparison that, to my surprise, none of the students seemed to recognize. So they recognized the first few lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're all endowed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they didn't know what came right after the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And the students were quite surprised to find that there's this history of resistance that's demanded by their own Declaration of Independence. So turning the lecture hall into a space for seeking answers to questions about resistance would, I hoped, at least let them remember the challenges in the process of taking evidence and drawing conclusions. I'm convinced that after the final exam, they may not remember the specifics about why people, the amounts of unemployment or who was who in whichever uprising, but I wanted them to have the skills and the big picture that they could use as a framework in the future. Comparisons with the United States are potentially fraught for all kinds of reasons, but because it's what the students have as their lived experience, the US contexts seem paradoxically to help them rethink how they know what they think they know and invite them to reconsider the motives of resistors. And all of this has become more challenging in the age of COVID-19. This year, instead of flipping the classroom, I turned the survey upside down. COVID has been making communication less certain. I mean, I have students whose computers are doing what Jim's was doing. Students have to drop out from time to time for technological, medical, family, or health reasons. So my usual linear chronological trajectory of 200 years didn't seem like a good idea because they would have lost too much if they had to step out for a while. So I did what I've been doing in my current book project. I took a series of crises and used them to explore the past that led to now. It's a chance to take a deep dive from the present into the past, providing background and context, but making students work out the chronologies on their own and with their teaching assistants. Working across the timelines also forces them to see connections at various points in the past and across state borders. As Kylie Broderick, well known to Jadalia and one of my superstar teaching assistants, described it in her words, the Arab Uprisings are a case study in how limited we are in understanding the region if we contain ourselves in the national borders, erasing otherwise very obvious connections. They have to figure out the connections in the past and across the region by creating their timelines of these 6 contemporary issues well into the past. So instead of focusing for the whole course then, 10 years on, the Arab Spring is just one of 6 crises we're exploring. Each has a guest expert to discuss the present. This one was one of our hosts. Thank you, Bassam. And then we go back in time to figure out how we got there. That particular guest lecture was terrific. And I'm hoping that the students work harder to understand the past when they know really what's at stake in their present. But at another level, it's sad that instead of the culmination of history, the uprisings can easily be read into the past as one more crisis period simply to be managed. Perhaps it would help to point out that the places that weren't the centers for the original Arab Spring have now taken.
You've hit your time. Just want to let you know. Sorry about that.
My time is up.
Yeah, but please take a few seconds to wrap up, please.
Okay. I kept a teaching blog during the survey in 2012 and looked back on it in preparation for this. The students read Jim's Arab Uprisings, What Everyone Needs to Know is Background, but in class we focused on performance and culture. We had a local poet who had traveled to Egypt and Tunisia and presented poetic portraits of a revolution as a performance piece and talked to the class. Omar Efendim talked to the class as well. And I asked students, I'm a historian, it's really hard to try to figure out whether I should be giving time up to this sort of thing. And the students were really articulate. One explained that we can learn about emotions, fears, hopes from poetry and music in ways that political economy can't match. Another offered a metaphor that I want to leave you with. Learning about politics and economy are like studying the banks of a river, he said. They show the shape and direction of history, but to really understand the river, you need to wade in, to feel the temperature of the water, and to get wet.
Thank
So
you
here's
so
to
much, Sarah, for that wonderful metaphor and for basically encouraging your students to sort of put their, to put their self as if they are facing the challenges that the people of the region are. I think, humanizing and drawing on those comparative examples is always a really solid way to sort of get students to think outside the box, or certainly outside of the media environment they find themselves in. So thank you for your insights on that. We're going to transition now to Professor Ali Ahmida. Am I pronouncing their name? I apologize. I think you're on mute. Oh, Professor Ali, I think your microphone is muted. Oh, sorry.
In Libya, North Africa, and the Maghreb, it's called Hmeda.
Hmeda, okay. Forgive me.
It's a nickname for Mohammed. When mothers give nickname to their children, they say, in Egypt, they say Hamada. In North Africa and the Maghreb, they say Hmeda.
Hmeda, okay. Well, very nice to have you, Professor Hmeda, with us. And we're looking forward to your insights on this topic as well. And I want to transition to you.
I would like first to thank Bassam and Amani. This is terrific and a refreshing topic, pedagogy and teaching of the Arab uprisings. And I think it's really, I haven't seen it much, pedagogy in itself, but also linking it to this really, very important event in the region is very timely, in my opinion. What I'm going to do to share with you my own reflection and assessment of what I do in terms of teaching is to focus, tell you a little bit about what's the nature of my experience in teaching, and then share with you some insights about some of the challenges that I have faced in teaching this topic, and also some of the lessons and maybe the breakthroughs that I had with in teaching, and also my students in interacting in the classroom, maybe taught each other and taught me how to really best try to grapple with these very, very monumental events and questions that with us. I teach in a small college called University of New England, and actually most of my students are undergraduates. The classes luckily are between 15 and 20. So we have the quality of interacting and experimenting in the classroom that allows us to go in more depth than maybe if the class is really huge and you have to deal with a quantity that could be undermining what do you do with the interaction in a subject as really challenging as the Arab uprising. Also, there is another factor, that I should share with all of you. I'm the founding chair of this program, which allowed me, being a rebellious young social scientist, to really run away from political science and mainstream American social sciences. So the university trusted me to build a program, an innovative program that's, when I built it, it was interdisciplinary, historically oriented, open to other fields, and therefore it doesn't go along with the dominant models of teaching political science in the United States. So these are some of the factors that are important in teaching the Arab uprisings. And in my case, most of my young students at UNE, they don't know much about the region. They don't even know the geography of the region. But at the same time, they are like any other young men and women. They bring indirectly the socialization, the modalities of the dominant paradigms, American exceptionalism, Orientalism, modernization theory, all of these filtering concepts that they were introduced to in their schools and their entertainment and in their society. So therefore, I think for me is to understand what my students have gone through and what they are introduced to and what they know and what they don't know is very essential, because it allows me to interact with them in the classroom. And I think this is here, one pushes that argument a little bit. The universities provide opportunities, but also part of the problems in teaching the Arab uprisings. So therefore, I think to contextualize this whole experience, I have to focus on two questions. Theory, what to teach, and pedagogy, how to teach the Arab uprisings. Now, I think when it comes what to teach, it was very useful for me and my students to reflect about these dominant paradigms. What Jim Scott used to say, public and hidden transcript. Or what the late Edward Said tried to do is to say that the Orientalist colonial scholarship not only invented the East, it's also invented the West. And that the East and the West are intertwined in many ways. And I think in that sense, being aware of that for me and my students was really the first step. Because texts are not written, paradigms try to filter the news about the other, including the Arab war and Arab uprising, through the prisms of either modernization theory or lack of empire, no history, secularization and westernization. And I think in that sense, when I try to introduce my students to this topic, I had to put the context in. And what we do, we debate. I teach the debate itself. What do we know and what we don't know? I teach the Orientalist debate, for and against. I teach also modernization theory, for and against. And also I let them get involved and that through these debates become aware of what's really, how knowledge is produced, how culture is produced, and also including the idea of what happened before the Arab Spring. And we discuss how stalled and how much failure has happened in the field of teaching the Middle East and North Africa, and how the fact that the Arab uprising shocked people, because for a long time the mainstream teaching, and we look at it, is really said that the region is really exceptional. So we confront the problem of knowledge heads on. And I try to engage my students into thinking about what happened, what went wrong. Let's try to explain it. And then after that, we try to have a way of slowly building questions. Sometimes I send them questions on every Friday ahead of the reading. Sometimes my students bring questions of their own, and we go over them together. But what I try to do, and this is a reflection of my own choices. I made a choice. I was trained in political science, historical sociology, and African history. And my work has been on anti-colonial resistance. So the Arab Spring really is a comfortable topic for me. It's very, very much. And what I try to do, since I teach courses like late 20th century social comparative revolutions in 3 continents, or maybe gendered nationalism, or maybe a course like state-society relations in North Africa. What we try to do is to introduce the idea that there is a society. There is a mujtama' ahli and mujtama' madani. That the idea of the Arab Spring landed from the sky, or because people became really versed in westernization, or because of human rights or socializations, is really has to be checked and examined. and to look at the indigenous local traditions of resistance, mobilization, and also thinking. And here what I try to do, and I teach the theories of resistance, of language, but also theories of revolutions, not just in the region, in general. So what I do, I go over 3 schools of social revolutions, and then I synthesize it by examining 5 questions that my students found down to earth and also critical enough to avoid the colonial knowledge, Orientalist knowledge, and all of these dominant paradigms that dominated the construction and the production of knowledge in academia, either about the Arab world or Africa or Asia or the West itself. So confronting exceptionalism meant for us in my classes is not just confronting the burden and the heritage of the representation and power and empire in the area of production of knowledge, but also re-examining the traditions that's anti-colonial, anti-elitism, egalitarian movement in the West as well. So they go hand in hand, in other words. I was lucky that I studied these movement outside of the Arab world. So what I do is we examine cases and we don't do surveys. And also each case is not alone. And I'll come to that in a minute. The other important factor that's
Dr.
also...
Kraidy, sorry, you're about 1 minute over your time allocated.
Okay, let me conclude then to be faithful to the time. I come from a long genealogy of storytellers, so it's very hard for me to stop. So anyway, what I'm gonna say, we focus on sources of state crisis, sources of alienation, sources of social mobilization, and then struggle over the new order. And that allows us not to be fixated on the uprising himself, but counter-revolution, failure, defeats, and long-term, because the struggle in the Arab world, me and my students examine, is national and social.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid, and very nice to see how you've expanded on the Arab revolutions and uprisings to sort of encapsulate the historical developments, they sort of, tie it into the history of colonialism, failed state formation, things of that sort. So that's that was very interesting to hear. So thank you so very much. Last but not least, who's been very patient, Dr. Hatem El-Hibri, who is actually Bassam's colleague at George Mason University. We are delighted to have you. You've been with us for the full 2 panels as well, like several of you. So with no further ado, Hatem, I'm going to transition over to you.
Amani, I'm going to try to be concise. If we're running over time, I'll try to be concise. I think that I might be the only one here who has co-taught a course or part of a course on the uprisings with Bassam. And I say that not to make my build. I'm sorry, is that true?
I think that's true. I think that's true. Although in a sense, when we all talk to Bassam, we're all sort of learning from Bassam as well. So, but nevertheless, yes.
Well, so I bring that up because, it's one of the things that I've thought of as I've heard the rest of my co-panelists speaking about this very important issue, one that's near and dear to my heart, is sort of the question of the epistemic culture of different fields, different disciplines, the social sciences versus the humanities, and how they approach something like a revolution or something like uprisings. And one of the things that I've always felt is that the political stakes of something like the Arab uprisings has made all of us feel the shortcomings of our own disciplinary background. We're all sort of reaching for what are the additional intellectual tools that I need from outside of my own training so as to better grapple with this other thing that I know is super important, but that I myself am not perhaps as familiar with. So my talk is titled Media and the Arab Uprisings, and my background is in media studies, which is a strange interdiscipline with a range of maybe a set of objects, but even the field doesn't totally agree even what the objects are, much less the theoretical and methodological tools to approach it. It's very wide-ranging. So some of the challenges and concerns of teaching Arab uprisings that others on this panel and the one before have mentioned are ones that I share. But I'm going to try to speak to the question of media as the analytical focus, the object of study, rather than something that is added if and when it supports a different disciplinary focus or pedagogical outcome. So just to sort of bracket my own experience here, I've taught about the Arab uprisings both at AUB when I was on the faculty there, and also here at George Mason University, although most of my teaching on this topic has been since I've been here back in the US. So here at George Mason, it's most often come up as either a class on film and media in the region more broadly, framed in terms of the Middle East, not the Arab world. And it's also now more recently come up as a class on revolution, although of course I try to smuggle in something about the Arab uprisings into many of the classes that I've taught beyond just those two foci. Now this is another way of saying that I've consistently tried to grapple with, like, how do I teach this subject, media and the uprisings, to people who either have maybe a familiarity or an academic background in the study of the region, but very little with media, or they're familiar with media, they've thought about media seriously or thought about film and film aesthetics seriously, but know very little about the region. So the first thing that I tried to do is I tried very hard to contextualize this event, both in terms of its history. And the thing that I've found to be one of the most important things to do here is to really de-exceptionalize the region and the event, right? To de-exceptionalize the event of revolutions, both because of their long history, and also to de-exceptionalize the region. Like there isn't some kind of special dysfunction of the region which leads to outsized political passions and therefore revolutions. So like really, like where did they come from? Where did these different events come from? And why did they take the shape that they did? And the feeling amongst students that I try to push against here is like, I try to tell them like, look, you have this feeling that this is all too complex and you can't understand it. And no, actually, there's really concrete, very understandable reasons why things went the way that they did, right? If you put this even on a 50-year timeline, you would immediately say, oh, of course something was going to happen, right? We get the benefit of hindsight. I also try to emphasize the relationality that we in the classroom in that moment have with these events and these people, right? Like we don't get to step outside of time or to step outside of a relationship to these places and these events, right? Like this is not something back then, because in truth, I'm not sure that I can even tell them with confidence that these events are over. And it's not something that is simply over there, something far away and distant, right? This is a way to say that we have a great deal of responsibility to this subject matter. One of the things that I also try to foreground here in this sort of attempt to de-exceptionalize and contextualize the revolutions is like, I try to get people to confront their own political attitudes. And this is, I think, maybe this is true anywhere, right? How do your own attitudes about revolution come into play in how you assess these events? If you're a person who's just on some level deeply skeptical about the idea that revolution can lead to any kind of productive change, well, what is the intellectual genealogy that you are a part of that theorizes revolution in that way? How does that potentially shape your understanding of other people's unmitigated enthusiasm for the possibility of change? This is another way to say that it becomes really important to link not just context, but the question of context for any one uprising to a question of scale. So like recently in a class about film and revolution that I've been teaching, students surprised me here in that they were, maybe this is the US in 2020 and 2021 after the George Floyd uprisings and Black Lives Matter, but students were way more enthusiastic and optimistic about the prospect of revolution than I was expecting. They were maybe primed to be ready for somebody like CLR James pushing back against a narration of the history of modern revolutions that goes like American, French, Russian, and then everybody else is just a pale shadow of those, right? CLR James saying it's a much deeper, more radical set of solidarities and omissions that define the modern era. Thinking about media and revolutions is also a really productive entry point for other broader questions in media study, which go beyond sort of simple causal and deterministic explanations. Particularly here, it's important to understand the place of media in the public drama of revolutions, right? That revolutions are themselves of like a profound reshaping of public cultures, political cultures in general, that the affective dimension is core to what they are about, not something incidental to. And that affective core is sung in the key of historical agency and political rupture, the possibility of possibility. Now, there's a few other things that I'd like to point out that I try to focus on. One is like the question of media in the event. What is the place of media within these events? Media is not simply this thing which represents things after the fact, added on to the reality of the revolution, that actually we can think about media in terms of the practices and institutions which constitute it. So we've had a range of studies now which will think about the everydayness of media, even the everydayness of media within revolutions, that will think the place of movement and mobility and the relationship between embodied mobility and the circulation of, say, images, sound, and affect. You can think here of people like Tariq Sabri or even Marwan, who was on the previous panel, who've written about this. If media are constitutive of the event, then the event itself opens onto a question of liminality. So we have recent work from someone like Walter Armbrust, who would emphasize sort of the open-ended liminal state that particularly Egypt ends up with. And we find, and actually I found that his text is actually really useful to think about Egyptian film, which deals with the unresolved nature, the crushing sense of unendedness, unclosedness that emerges with the Egyptian uprising. And this reminds me also here of how thinkers like Stuart Hall would comment on the politics without guarantees. You know, these are different sort of hooks that can get people into thinking about how can film and media both be understood to be a part of these events in the lived immediate sense, but also reflect on the echoes and afterlives that emerge afterwards. I'm trying to keep myself on track. So like dealing with the question of revolution, like for me, at least in the classes that I deal with, means thinking carefully about the relationship of politics to aesthetics, right? Aesthetics as not simply a question of formal artistic styles, although it is of course also that, but in that much broader sense, the formation of what is sensible, thinkable, and sayable in any given moment, in any given conjuncture. And it is precisely there that we find some of the most fervent revolutionary energy, the real stakes and implications of the reformulation of public culture. Like, how can we even talk about the problems in a language which is fundamentally hostile to our liberation? This is where, when I'll teach films, I'll try to like ask very pointed questions with students, like, how does this film ask us to relate to this event? If it's documentary film, or if it's journalistic production, what is the kind of witnessing that it is asking us to do? What is the politics of spectatorship here? What kinds of solidarities are made possible or rendered impossible? I usually try to like inculcate in students a real skeptical attitude about either the heroic mode or the mode of victimization, or the cynical mode about outcomes that happen after the fact. And one of the things that they quickly, once I tell them that this is something that we can do, that I give them permission to do, they start to immediately describe this in terms of the dehumanization of the actual people involved. To render people heroic or to render them blank victims means to tell stories about other people's lives with a moral lesson, and then awarding films a number of stars based on how well or powerfully they teach that moral lesson, which again, it's like a distancing operation. The other thing that I will try to point to is that the uprisings are not simply just about the uprisings. There's both a context which informs where they come from, but also the uprisings can be a lens onto recent and more recent developments in the cultural history of the region, but also the deeper resonances that this moment opens up with the past, which shouldn't be understood to be past, but sometimes falls out of our memory. So things like film, TV, TV talk shows, journalism, and online life become a central part of the social, cultural, and political and intellectual life of the uprisings. Like media are found and echo in all of these other venues as well. People come to think in terms of media forms in all kinds of unexpected ways. And this is not just true of the uprisings. We can think of this in previous moments, certainly in I think, at least since the 19th century. People think about media and its relationship to politics and space in quite distinct ways, going back that far. We can also see here how it becomes really important when to show students how something like the question of gender and national liberation and uprising have certainly an immediate resonance with the movements, the moment of decolonization in the 50s and 60s. So in this class on film and revolution that I'm teaching, it's very hard to pick what to show, but I opted for Hani Surur's film, The Hour of Liberation Has Arrived, which is a very striking documentary about the feminist guerrilla movement fighting against the Omani and British Sultanate in the 1970s, right? So this question of feminist critique.
Sorry to interrupt you, but so say you've hit your time, but this is fascinating stuff here. So please.
Right. So I'm basically saying like that, like women have been radical in the region going far back. It's not suddenly women have figured out that they are oppressed. That this has a history and even a history of radical women filmmaking prefiguring the uprisings. So what I'm urging everyone to think of is like media are an object in and of their own right, and there's a great deal that one can do by considering it as an object within the global political economy which produces the uprisings.
Thank you so much, Hatem, for that insight into the role of the media that shapes, reflects, and more or less reproduces some of the political realities on the ground. I know we are, this has been a fascinating panel. I want to thank all our panelists. If I may, due to my collaborator, what he put me on the spot on the last panel to see, Bassem, if you could ask a question of our esteemed panelists, one departing question before we leave, so they can have the final word. I would really welcome that from you.
I mean, I have so many questions, but I'm also aware that we are running out of time in just 1 minute. Thank you all for really insightful comments. I mean, you think you've had 10 years of teaching and reading about the uprisings, and then all of a sudden you hear certain words or concepts or angles, frankly, angles in terms of approaching something that that actually really vitalizes one's imagination about the uprising. This is a pedagogy panel on teaching the uprisings, and I would like to ask everyone here if specifically they use film, which is something that we are actually working on in this project to produce like a database of films and documentaries, but not just films and documentaries as a list and here you go, pick one and show it, but specifically how to teach it. So if everyone can share with us one item, whether it's a film or a documentary that they like to show, whether it's about a particular case or a theme like gender, environment, political economy, or if it's a film about the uprisings in general, which also exist. They don't tend to be the best ones, but if everyone can share with us one example of a film or a documentary that they assign and why. This way you have a minute and it's kind of doable. Maybe we can start like Manny shared earlier with the order in which people spoke, starting with,
I think we lost Jim on the panel.
Yeah, we lost Jim, so we'll start with Khalid. Sorry, yeah, Khalid, you thought you had a minute to think about it, مش هيك?
No, I have to be honest, this is why it's so exciting to hear everyone speak. I usually don't use documentaries or films whatsoever. My classes are very large, and there may be 300 students, so it's the organizational aspect can be an issue, but it's so important. I'm so inspired by the use of that. I do use clips of the protest movements, that is clips that are taken from iPhones and mobile phones from that are put on Twitter and Facebook and things like that. But it's also exclusively in Arabic in the Sudanese case. So utilizing them is not always that good. But you know what? This is why I'm here. I am so excited about utilizing in the future.
All right. How about if we move? No, I mean this is fair because frankly, I'll just say one thing from my experience. I've been teaching a course on the uprisings for several years, on and off, and I I very much stress that it's much better not to offer a film or a documentary on the uprising unless you're going to actually teach it rather than, hey, watch this and let's talk about it. This is not productive, so this is totally fine. But let's move to Sarah, if you have anything to share in that regard.
I'm looking forward to learning how to teach a film. I use short film clips from music videos, but that's one of the things that I'll be looking at the website for in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, this is like totally fair, which is actually something that gets us to, think harder and deeper about presenting this module on films. And there is a teaching module that's going to accompany each film, which addresses or suggests ways to utilize this film, either to debunk existing conceptions or to reinforce ones that are important or to highlight something in particular. So sorry, Amani, I am disappointing you with my questions because we're not getting a lot of engagement. Ali and then Hatem.
No, that's great.
You're on mute, Azizi.
I know. Thanks, Bassam. I do teach a film class, and at the end, I do teach aspect of the Arab Spring or Arab Uprising more precisely. I haven't seen anything that really dazzled me or really find effective. I do have, because I traveled to Tunisia and Libya and also Egypt, I have my own photos, my own slides. I do that, share that. Some front line on Egypt was very useful, but my favorite, Bassam, is since I do study the long-term process leading to the uprising, is 4 Women from Egypt by Tahani Rashid. It's a brilliant work. And if you want to understand the long-term traditions of resistance that led to the uprisings in the 2010, 2011, it's one of my favorite ones.
Shukran. Hatem, the floor is yours. You actually can take up a couple of minutes because, first of all, you're a media studies specialist. And second, a lot of people yielded the floor for you. So there's extreme pressure on you to enlighten us in 2 minutes.
I mean, if there's going to be like one thing that I'll say, it's that, we should all, I think everyone here is sort of rightfully skeptical of the idea of using like a documentary to just like teach or fill in context. It's like a shorthand way to say, here's like some background on the Tunisian uprising, or here's some background on Sudan, right? This is of course like a very limited treatment of like the object itself, but also it inevitably will come up short compared to say like 20 pages of somebody who has a really crisp writing style and sharp analytical lens. Having said that, there are things which I think, say like film or even the right people live streaming from, say, the 2019 protests in Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan can be really useful for. And one of the things that can be really useful for is like, how are these things narrated? How does the camera itself act as a narrator in these events? And what are the so one of the things I will try to teach is like, what are the real limitations of the assumption that like a documentary has to like capture reality, that there is a reality out there and the documentary needs to be as faithful to it as it can. a lot of the stuff that comes out of Egypt after 2011 is like very skeptical of that idea, right? There's a real experimentation with narrative and aesthetic form that comes out of Egypt. So one documentary which I teach, which spends a good chunk of its time alternating between animation and close interviews, is Ahmed Noor's film Waves, Moog, which first of all, I like it because it's not set in Tahrir, it's set in Suez. It spends some time interviewing a previous generation of sort of labor-led activists and radicalization. And also it spends some time in not just sort of the rush of revolt, but also in like the ambiguity, the ambivalence, the dispiriting moment that comes after the counter-revolutionary crackdown. It starts to linger in that space, even though the film itself comes out before like the ascent of ceasing. I'll stop there.
Thank you. May I say one thing, Amani, since you expected more of me? Uh, just one thing. I did teach a class with the formidable Hatem, from whom I learned a lot about his approach, which first I thought when I was first started listening to him give the first lecture, I was like, what is this guy talking about? And then I realized this whole approach of looking at things differently, which is actually very much part of how he spoke today, was extremely refreshing, which is why it's very important for us to interact with each other, because we don't know what we're going to learn, like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. So it's wonderful. It was wonderful. And let me just say that we actually did not end up showing a lot of films, even though the class actually addressed this directly. We weren't showing tons of films. We were very selective, and we were actually more successful for it, because when you give students tons of audiovisual material, you're not going to get back what you expect, it because of the lack of selectivity, and then the lack of a sort of careful curated treatment of each item of this sort. I'll stop here. I'll take it back to Amani, and thank you all very much for joining us, and to everyone who stayed a few minutes beyond the time. You're muted, Aziz T.
Muted.
Thank you so much for your patience, for your wonderful insights. This is going to be so valuable for our project, but also for the field more generally. Really, really appreciate the wonderful conversations we've had with you this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again in our future programs. And with that, we're going to leave you all again. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.